Welcome to the Cultivo Podcast, where we talk about the science, finance, technology, and people, building landscape resilience at speed and scale. I'm Sean Leslie, and today I'm here talking with Tamara Moctezuma, Cultivo's social impact and policy manager. Tamara leads the design and implementation of land steward engagement and social impact processes for Cultivo's nature-based projects around the world. She's passionate about developing sustainable, inclusive approaches to ecosystem regeneration that position the stewards of the land as key decision makers and primary beneficiaries to create a more equitable and resilient future for both people and the planet. Originally from Mexico, Tamara grew up in the great state of Texas and is now based in London, England, although she's coming to us today from Sarasota, Florida. Tamara holds a Master of Science in Environmental Policy and Regulation from the London School of Economics, and she also graduated as valedictorian from New York University, where she earned her Bachelor of Arts in Global Liberal Studies with a concentration in politics, rights, and development. Dang, that is super impressive. Welcome, Tamara. How are you?
Thank you, Sean. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well.
I'm really excited for this conversation.
Me too.
So this is a fascinating topic we're about to get into. We're going to talk about how you help Cultivo design inclusive approaches to ecosystem regeneration. But first, I want you to tell me, who has been your biggest inspiration in the field of landscape regeneration, and what did you learn from them?
It's a great question. And while he's not specifically in the field of landscape regeneration specifically, a huge personal inspiration to me is my grandfather. So he's an avian virologist, and he worked with the FAO in countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And he was studying avian viruses and then training and working with local experts and communities to improve the health of their birds. And in a lot of ways, my career has begun to parallel his. So, I mean, I'm focused more on the health of the land while he was focused on the health of the birds, but, working with local communities and experts across the world to increase the health of our planet. So he's definitely a big inspiration for me in the field of environmental work.
That's awesome. Your grandfather, you said?
Yes. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
What a great legacy.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about your background and what you do for Cultivo. And so it's an interesting education, an interesting thing to study, and an interesting thing to do for work. So what inspired you to focus your education and career on the intersection of policy, social impact, and ecosystem regeneration?
Yeah, so I mean, I originally was focused a lot more on kind of pure human rights work. So I was really interested in looking into why a lot of top-down measures to protect human rights fall short. And I was engaging directly with underserved communities to understand where there was a disconnect between what was being done at the global level and what was happening at the grassroots level. So that was what I was kind of doing with my undergrad. I worked at an immigration law firm. I dabbled a little bit with the UN, an organization to counter violent extremism. So really focused in the pure human rights space. And then the summer after graduation from NYU, interestingly enough, I started rewatching actually, a lot of the Planet Earth and in general, David Attenborough's nature documentary. It is not a unique story by any means, but I was really blown away by how beautiful our planet is and how fragile a lot of these ecosystems are and how much they need our protection and our support. And I really started to realize that moving forward, human rights and environmental work are not going to be two separate fields. They are interlinked in so many different ways. So I just kind of pivoted into the intersection of social impact and environmental work. And then, the policy aspect, I think, is great macro framing for the context of my work. But really, I realized, what's good for the planet is good for the people and vice versa. So I kind of just naturally fell into that after graduation.
Yeah, it's amazing how, as you said, uplifting one uplifts the other in terms of the environment and the people who live in it. And it seems to be true all over the world.
Absolutely.
With that in mind, can you talk a little bit about what you do at Cultivo and what does, say, a typical week look like for you?
Sure. So I'm sure you have the same feeling, but no 2 weeks are like at Cultivo, which is part of the magic of the job. But I would say typical desk-based weeks. So when I'm not conducting field work, will usually include, first of all, a good amount of internal and external calls and engagement with different stakeholders to understand how the projects that we're developing are coming along. So just seeing what's happening on the ground, identifying where the social impact team might need to step in to support or address any topics to make sure that we're developing our projects ethically, that we're being effective, and that we're centering land steward voices. So that'll be a big part of the work. Then there's a lot of planning and then overseeing and processing of data from our field work. So when we do our land steward engagement and social impact processes, preparing for that field work, executing the field work, oftentimes I'm overseeing field partners that are doing that work for us, and then processing the outcomes of those experiences. I also engage a lot with our field partners to understand what's going on the ground. So there's just this constant feedback loop between me and the first point of contact with our land stewards to understand how things are progressing and where any issues might be arising. Then one of the more creative aspects of my job is designing new processes. So as our projects continue to mature and as we expand into different socioeconomic and ecological contexts, the kind of processes that we need are very different. So just designing and adapting what we have now to fit those contexts is another big part of my job. And then another piece more on the compliance side is just answering questions for investors and off-takers and auditors and facilitating the certification of our projects.
Very cool. Thanks for explaining your your very diverse work and all the stuff you do at Cultivo. It must be nice to spend some time at a desk, but also some time in the field connecting
Yes.
with these people. How do you find, with that experience, how do you find that social impact and environmental goals reinforce each other in the context of our projects?
Yeah, so I think this is something that is really key because unlike, for example, environmental projects that focus on setting up solar panels or wind turbines, our projects hinge on behavioral change. And what you'll see is that there's a really nice symbiotic relationship a lot of time between land stewards and the ecosystem, in that land stewards want to continue with rural ways of life. They want to continue working on their land and living there. But these ways of life are often threatened by ecosystem degradation and rural flight that's driven by a lack of support and social infrastructure and opportunities in the countryside. So I think there's a really nice virtuous cycle that can happen where you support social outcomes and then that leads to environmental outcomes, and it just, everybody's happy. So I think this is something that is again very central to our projects because the project activities that we use all involve land stewards and their management of the land.
And you travel all over to visit these projects. Can you give us a real world example of where the social impact and the environmental impact worked together or as you said, sort of played off each other?
Yeah, sure. So I think this is something that I've seen, to be honest, all over. So it's very interesting because I think there are a lot of challenges facing rural communities right now that are the same regardless of where you go in the world. Maybe there's a little bit of a different flavor, but the underlying theme is the same, which are ranchers wanting to continue to stay on their land, but they're struggling to deter more financially attractive yet potentially environmentally damaging opportunities. So a lot of people, especially in grasslands that are working with their land, will have a lot of really attractive offers to convert their land to forest or to cropland to be more productive or to produce more financially. Oftentimes they're saying, you're not even going to have to work your land. We'll set up this forest. We'll manage it for you. You get a lot more than you're making now. And that's a very difficult thing to say no to for a lot of these land stewards because they have to think at the end of the day about their livelihoods and their families. And then, real estate development is another issue that comes into play in a lot of areas that are closer to cities. So by making ranching more financially viable and sustainable, which is one of the outcomes of ecosystem regeneration, we are helping to keep these land stewards on their land doing what they love. And again, this is a theme that I've seen North America, South America, Africa. So I've seen it in lots of different contexts.
So how do these projects benefit the land stewards?
Yeah, so there's a whole host of different benefits. The most direct one is what everybody tends to think of when they hear the word benefits. So that's in terms of benefit sharing. So a portion of our carbon credit revenue sales will go back to the land stewards, and then they are financially incentivized and they get, a piece of the pie in that way. But there are a lot of other more intangible benefits that they receive from participating in our projects. So, for example, we empower them with what we call eco-literacy. So that those are tools to read and manage their land. So to understand what their land is trying to tell them. If there's certain species expressing themselves, what does that mean? What is the health of the soil? What is the land trying to tell them? There's this beautiful dialogue that can take place between those that are seeing the land day in and day out and the land itself. A lot of times, ranchers are kind of thinking more at the animal level or if anything at the grass level, but not at the soil level. So just getting them to go a level deeper and understand all of those different layers and what they're telling them is a big part of our work. And we actually see that a lot of land stewards get really excited when you start to show them these tools because they're seeing this every day and they might intuitively have already picked up on some of this, but they didn't have the tools or the right words to explain what they were already processing internally. So that's one thing, empowering them with eco-literacy and capacity building so they can learn how to manage their land sustainably. Climate resilience. So that's another massive benefit, is that when you have a strong, healthy ecosystem, it's going to be a lot more resilient to events like droughts and floods. So that's a massive thing where they're going to see in the future, with climate events becoming more common, they're going to see that there is a resilience to their land that they wouldn't have otherwise. And that will have a lot of financial, mental benefits of not having to deal with the stress of those climatic events. Also increased productivity. So, as they improve the health of the land and there's more diverse species, they will typically see more nutritious species for the livestock expressing themselves, because they can guide the land in that way. And so it'll become more productive. They might have to rely less on inputs and fodder and things to supplement feed and things to supplement the feed for the livestock. Increased biodiversity is another massive one. Increased efficiency of grazing management and livestock monitoring. So a lot of times, maybe at the very beginning, land stewards will be a bit daunted by the prospect of having to plan out their grazing and keep records of their grazing, but they soon realize that there's a lot of efficiencies to be gained in planning things out. First of all, just being prepared and organized. And second of all, one thing that comes up time and time again is the fact that currently, if you have a more continuous grazing or a less structured grazing model, land stewards have to go around their entire property to see all of their livestock, to just check in. How is it doing? Are there any health issues? Anything that needs to be taken care of? When you know that they're going to be in paddock X on this day, you can just go to that paddock. There's all your livestock. You can take a look at them in one go. So you don't have to be driving around a lot. So that saves a lot of time and effort for the land stewards. So they'll see a lot of increased efficiency. And then improved well-being. So just their mental and emotional state for a lot of these land stewards working in the great outdoors is a massive benefit. And that's one of the main reasons they're working in this space.
Mhm.
So seeing the land healthy, seeing things thriving will just improve their well-being as well.
That's great. I think you and I can both attest to feeling sort of more energetic and inspired when we're working outside at these places.
Oh, absolutely. It's crazy what, 10 hours of screen time versus 10 hours of field work does. It's just, I'm a completely different person at the end of the day.
Different kinds of tired too.
Yeah.
Well, you talked about some of the places you've been. Can you share an example of or a story from the field where you saw some of this meaningful community engagement?
Yeah. So I think a really big thing, and we can probably delve into this a little bit more later, but is the role of workers in private ranching projects. And this is something that I think is undervalued currently in the market. And I've been quite a big advocate for involving workers a lot more directly in those initial consultation information sharing sessions. So I think a really good example of this is in Uruguay. We set up a couple of focus groups with workers, and there was some concerns about, well, will they understand it? Will they be excited about it? Do they care? Does this make sense? Is this relevant for them? And after the first focus group, we asked for feedback. And, a lot of times ranch hands are, they're not very expressive. And this is speaking generally. Of course, there's wide variance, but they're people of few words. So the feedback we got was astounding. I wasn't expecting much. And they just said, usually people come to us and they're just telling us how to produce more grass or take better care of the livestock. So having somebody come and actually ask us what we think, what our opinions are, what our ideas are, is really admirable. And they were very excited to be a part of it. And I think that was a big proof point for me, and that this strategy that we're working for is valuable and it is necessary. Because again, at the end of the day, these are the people that will be moving the cattle day in and day out. So it makes sense to involve them.
Yeah. That has been my experience meeting in Mexico, the vaqueros. They were, as you said, not the most talkative people, but super friendly and really good people in general.
Absolutely.
Is there someone specifically that you've met on any of these projects that comes to mind is in terms of building that kind of relationship?
There's been a lot. I mean, I've been very fortunate to have a lot of wonderful connections with different land stewards around the world. So I think there's quite a few people. So more than one specific person, I would just highlight something that has been really impressive for me in this field work is just all of the stories, the personal and family histories that these land stewards have shared with me. They've absolutely blown me away. I mean, their dedication, their care, their love for their land and their livestock is truly admirable. And I think working as a land steward, I mean, whether you're a multi-generational landowner working to protect your family's legacy, or you're a ranch hand with a deep call and love for cattle and the great outdoors, it requires a lot of resilience, a lot of risk taking, and a lot of trust. It's not an easy path, and I would argue that it keeps getting harder. So the more personal stories I hear about what people have gone through just to keep being able to work the land, the
Mm.
more my respect and admiration for them grows.
Absolutely. You just reminded me of a story I heard when I was down in Mexico on some of the ranches. And one of the current vaqueros, his father had worked on a ranch that he now works on for his whole life. And when he retired, he'd been living on the ranch, and he just continued to live there in retirement, even though he was no longer
James?
working the ranch, because that's where he felt most comfortable, and he loved the land, and it was a really sort of telling moment, you know.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, a lot of them are saying, I'm going to be buried on this piece of land. And, where there's stories where they have had to maybe sell all their land and then maybe rebuild from start over from zero. It's impressive to see the way they do that and just the connection they have with their land. It's really like a child to them. So it's I think very impressive once you start to understand that relationship and see it up close.
Totally. It can be hard. I experienced this a little bit, or maybe I put this on myself, but it seems hard sometimes to come to a part of the world or an area where I'm not from and feel like I'm giving advice or, trying to help people who have lived on this land, as you said, for generations. So in terms with that, and you obviously are an expert in this, how do you build trust with those local communities when you're coming in to work on these kind of projects?
Yeah, so a great question. I think it is something that's really important to consider when you're thinking about how to engage with land stewards. The central point for me is coming in knowing that you are going to learn a lot more from them than they are going to learn from you. And you are just a conduit for translating the world of, in my case right now, carbon markets and certifications into their realities, but centering their knowledge and asking questions and seeking to learn more and never assuming you know is a really good way to build trust. I think otherwise you run the risk of coming in in my case, looking like somebody who's living in London, sitting behind their desk at a laptop and coming in and telling them how to manage their cattle. And that's never going to get you off on the right foot. And the reality is, I know a lot about a lot of things, but about their land and how to manage it and what will work for them, they are the experts. So always putting myself in a position of being a student, being somebody who's learning, who's there to ask questions and understand, I think is great. And I've seen that people get very excited. They love to share their knowledge and they love to share their experiences and to discuss and collaborate and create and think about what's a good model for them moving forward for their land. And I think when you approach the conversation like that, it's a lot more productive than if you're coming in and imposing on them. The conversation is completely different.
That's great advice, not just for our work, but I think in general,
Yeah,
in life.
absolutely. And I think another key component of building trust is just spending time connecting as humans. So I think because of the remote nature of a lot of these locations, oftentimes, I mean, we're staying overnight on the land. It's just hours to get to the closest city. So I think it's something where we tend to stay overnight on the ranches. So walking the land and then sharing meals, and I'm sure you probably experienced this in Mexico, but just having time to connect as humans is really important because we have the same goals at the end of the day, but we're all just working at this from different angles. And having that shared humanity, I think, is really valuable in trust building. So I think those extra couple of hours at the end of the day or at the start of a day can make all the difference.
Yeah, totally. I'm excited. I hope I get a chance to visit some of our projects within the United States because it's a big country, and I have to admit I don't know much about sort of ranches in the Southwest. So I am very curious to learn about some of that lifestyle and just the geography and topography and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about value sharing and compensation, very important topic in our industry. So how does Cultivo approach fair compensation and long-term value sharing for landowners and land stewards and workers?
Yeah, so I think this, and I've alluded to this a little bit already, but two key processes are first an information sharing process and then a robust consultation process at the start. And when I say information sharing, this means taking the time at the beginning of the project to really explain the entire context of the project. So what are carbon credits? What are carbon markets? Who are the different actors? What are the project activities that we're looking to implement? What do we hope those project activities will achieve? What are the potential costs, benefits, risks? Having a conversation to ensure that the land stewards really understand what they're getting into is invaluable. Without that step, you're not going to be able to have an effective consultation. So if they don't know what you're talking about, and we've seen this in other, there's been studies published on this, and I've seen this with other project developers in the field, there will be land stewards that think somebody's still going to come in with a bucket and grab the carbon and go sell it on a physical market. And so when you haven't addressed some of those core ideas of what we're trying to achieve, you can't have that meaningful consultation you're looking for. So after you ensure that the land stewards truly understand the context of the project, moving into a consultation where you talk about, well, this is what the project's going to take. You let us know what is needed on your land. Once you have an idea of the costs and the inputs that are going to be needed, then we can begin to structure the project financially and then establish a benefit sharing practice where we say, this is what we're thinking about doing. We're very transparent with where the revenues go, and we have a conversation with them so they understand where the money is heading. We also spend a lot of time understanding what land stewards value. Why are they participating in this project? So we might have our ideas of the benefits for them, but every land steward is going to see a different value in participating in the project. So it's understanding for each specific project, what is valuable for these land stewards and how do we emphasize that through the project design? So some of them might be really interested in water infrastructure and water maintenance. Some of them might be really interested in more productive grass. Some of them it is the financial revenues. Some of them it's just having that organization and having everything be planned. So you have to understand what's the value for this group of land stewards. And again, within those groups, that may vary as well. And how do we emphasize that and make sure that's a core component of this project? And then throughout the lifetime of the project, we have socioeconomic impact monitoring processes. We'll do surveys, adaptive management workshops, and we have field teams that are in constant contact with these land stewards so we can monitor and make sure that that value sharing is aligned. And so if the land stewards are ever feeling like it's unfair or they're unhappy with the way the values are being shared in the project, we can have a conversation around that.
That's great. It must be hard to ensure that the social outcomes, the positive social outcomes, mirror the positive environmental outcomes for our projects. How do you make sure that they scale at the same time and alongside each other?
So again, I kind of mentioned this before, but because our projects hinge on behavioral change, there is no scaling of environmental outcomes without scaling social outcomes. So the pace of regeneration is set by the land stewards. First come the social outcomes and then the environmental ones. And then there's this virtuous cycle between those two outcomes. So if there's no incentive, if there's no benefits for the land stewards, there's no reason for them to change their entire structure and way of working with their land. So you have to have the social outcomes start and then the environmental ones follow, and then they will scale concurrently through that virtuous cycle. We do, however, of course, have, as I mentioned before, socioeconomic impact monitoring processes where we are monitoring that impact to make sure that the social outcomes are what we're expecting in the same way that we monitor the environmental outcomes. And we have ongoing consultations and we have communication channels with all of the different land steward groups. And so we monitor that to make sure that that is the case.
So you've talked a lot about sort of the positive outcomes and when the social outcomes and the environmental outcomes are married, everything seems to work really well. That kind of community involvement obviously is crucial. What happens when it's missing?
Yeah. So without meaningful engagement, which two very common examples that I see are where people are either only working with land stewards that are in a position of authority. So you might be ticking the boxes that you're engaging with authority structures, or you're engaging with other sectors of the population, but only at a very high level. In a best case scenario, you simply don't get the necessary buy-in for ecosystem regeneration to happen. In a worst case scenario, you can cause significant harm to the land stewards unintentionally just because you aren't aware of what you're dealing with. So I think it is absolutely invaluable to have that sort of engagement happen. And I think it's again, something that needs to be varied by group. So you can't approach a community and think you're going to engage everybody in the same way. You can't approach a private ranch and think you're going to engage everybody in the same way. The first step is to understand the different land steward groups that you are working with and understand what their perspectives are, what their needs are, and then figuring out how you can engage them. So, for example, a lot of times landowners in private ranching contexts are comfortable with online conversations and calls, and they can go to the nearest city to have a conversation. Some ranch hands, if you sit them at a laptop or you take them to a city 4 hours away, which transportation can be a massive issue in and of itself, but even if you're able to get them there, if you're then sitting there and talking to them about carbon credits and the carbon markets and the voluntary carbon market, it's so out of their reality that you're going to lose them. It's not going to be an effective consultation. And again, you might tick the box. They might sit there and smile and nod and say, yes, this all sounds good. I understand. But you'll quickly realize that that's actually not the case. So it's understanding, how can I engage this specific landowner? How do I engage these workers? Between workers, there might be a lot of variance as well. In communities, of course, how do I engage the people who are in positions of authority? But then how do I ensure that I'm still communicating and engaging with the rest of the community as well? So I think that's something that is really important and should not be skimmed on. And yeah, as I said, when it's not present, I think you will quickly run into a lot of issues, which in a best case scenario, renders the project ineffective.
Hmm. It's that old cliche, meeting people where they are, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So how do you measure all of this? What metrics do you use to measure social impact at these projects?
Yeah, so we use a blend of different metrics and frameworks. So we've done a ton of literature reviews, spoken to different experts. I've pulled on my previous experiences as well. And we draw on industry standards for engaging with land stewards. For example, for the socioeconomic impact monitoring specifically, because again, we have kind of separate buckets for what we call engagement work and then social impact work. But for the social impact work, we have a theory of change that we've developed to identify human outcomes for our projects. So we'll look at what are the project activities? What do we hope will change in the ecosystem functions based on those activities? What changes do we expect that to create in the ecosystem services? And then what does that mean for the people involved in the project? And once we've identified those human outcomes, we can develop indicators that then measure those human outcomes. And these can be both positive, intended consequences or negative, unintended consequences. And we've used a whole host of different metrics and frameworks to develop this. So we use benefit relevant indicators and outcome-based indicators for that monitoring, for example. It can be quite a tricky question. I think a lot of times, a lot of these impacts aren't straightforward. So, for example, when you're talking about improving well-being, how do you measure well-being? There's so many different ways, and it looks so different for each person. So, I think socioeconomic impact monitoring is quite a tricky space, and a lot of times you have to figure out what are the best indicators for that specific scenario. So, it might seem straightforward, and of course, some of them are. When you have financial metrics or body condition scores for livestock or things that are quantifiable, but since a lot of this is more qualitative, figuring out the best way to get at what you're trying to measure is actually quite an art.
Yeah, it sounds like it. My brain was spinning just then trying to figure out some of those measurements. So thank you for following up with that.
Of course.
So in terms of sort of maybe investors in these projects or any financial stakeholders, why is it important to understand and care about the human dimension of these projects?
So it's so easy to get caught up in spreadsheets and bottom lines and in abstract conversations when you're in this global space that you forget that what we're doing and all of the decisions that we're making have a real life impact on actual human beings. So in the case of sustainable grasslands management projects, for example, we're asking ranchers or pastoralist communities to completely change the way they manage their livestock, which is often how their parents and grandparents manage their land. And this is something that we're asking them to break with tradition, to trust us with their livelihood, and to change their entire operation. This is not a small thing. So a lot of times it's easy to make decisions or ask for things when you aren't then there to witness the implications of those decisions on the ground. However, in order for us to have meaningful collaboration between financial stakeholders and land stewards, which is one of the main things we try to do at Cultivo, you have to have that perspective on, at the end of the day, these are humans we're all working towards the same goal. And every decision that we make in our spreadsheets, in these Zoom calls, in these conversations has an impact on these people. Otherwise, the systems are going to break down and you won't be able to achieve effective ecosystem restoration.
You know better than me. Is this something the social side, working with the local communities, do investors, is that top of mind when they come to us? And how do they react when you talk about this side of our projects?
So it's a great question. I think people are pretty good about looking at social safeguarding and no net harm. And for example, free, prior, and informed consent, I think, has now become an industry standard. So there is an awareness of the need to safeguard the human rights of the people involved in our projects. And then again, you do have some organizations that are a little bit more into the weeds of what this actually looks like on the ground, and they'll know to ask questions about social impact and land steward engagement.
Regarding some of the companies, have you ever had any sort of surprising conversations about introducing this concept or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had a lot of surprising conversations, but a lot of times these landowners can live in Miami and come visit the ranch, 4 times a year, if that. And so they're not there day in and day out. So the people that are moving the cattle, the people who are regenerating the ecosystem in terms of the physical activities, of course, the landowner plays a fundamental role in it, but they need to be involved as well. And it's my personal campaign in the market to try to involve other land steward groups more widely.
Yeah, I love that. That's a big thing that makes me proud to work at Cultivo. Do other organizations in our space, is a role like yours common for projects like this?
So a lot of times it will be kind of integrated with other roles. So having a dedicated social impact person, I wouldn't say is the most common. It's quite a unique space. So the few times I've come across people that are maybe working in this from a different angle or maybe in a different space. So if they're not in a project development capacity, but they're in a ratings capacity, or they're in certification development capacity, and they're looking at social impact and land steward engagement, it's super exciting. I'm like, let's share, let's talk, let's figure this out. I'm a big proponent of open sourcing. We're all working towards the same goal, so let's
Mm.
talk about how we can achieve these together and what's working for you, and I'll share what's working for me and what isn't working. So it is quite a rare role. I have It's been few and far between that I found people that are doing this sort of work in this capacity.
Interesting.
Yeah. Hopefully that starts to change.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're leading the charge here. So
Great.
uh,
Yeah.
it's as I said, it's something that makes me feel good about working at Cultivo, is knowing that there's someone like you making sure that we're doing right by the people on these landscapes as well as the planet.
Thank you. Thank you.
Speaking about those people, what have you learned? What's something you've learned from these land stewards that has maybe changed when you first started working at Cultivo? Maybe your approach has changed or your understanding of the projects has changed based on something you've learned from these land stewards.
So, I mean, I've learned a ton of different things. That could be a whole podcast in and of itself, lessons from land stewards. Maybe we park that for a later series. But I think one of the first things that I learned was really, as you said, you have to meet people where they are.
Mm.
So to regenerate their land, these land stewards are going to have to overcome a lot of different kinds of barriers: mental, logistical, financial, social, cultural. And we're here to help them and support them in that journey. But at the end of the day, they are the ones that have to overcome that. And again, a lot of times, for example, if you have multiple generations that are managing the land and you have a lot of different decision makers involved in the management of the land, that can be a very difficult conversation. Especially, we're seeing this transition, I mean, in the US and in a lot of different contexts where a lot of producers are old and they're looking towards retirement, and the younger generation is beginning to take the reins, and you'll see a difference in opinions of how land should be managed. So a lot of times it's difficult conversations where they'll say, I'm fully sold on regenerative grazing and rotational grazing, but my grandfather has this fear of drought, and he has this belief that if he's has cattle on a large piece of land and he has a certain amount of grass everywhere, then he's protected from drought. And that's just, a
Mm.
hangover from the great drought of 87 or whatever it may be. And so you'll see that there's a lot of different barriers for them, for the people around them. Again, logistically, having to subdivide paddocks, there's a lot that they're going to have to overcome. So if you come in with a boilerplate approach and you're saying, this is what you need to do, and this is the time you need to do it in, you won't be successful. This change doesn't happen overnight. And you might have some land stewards, and we've had land stewards that are both the landowners and the workers are saying, no, I've heard about rotational and regenerative grazing. I'm completely sold on it. Let's do it. I just need the support for that. And then that might be a lot faster of a process. But then you might have other people that are just starting to dip their toe into that world. And again, they have family that is involved in decision making that isn't sold. And so that's going
Mm.
to be a much longer and slower process. So to create real, sustainable, and lasting change, you have to meet people where they are and take them on that journey, and not come in and say, this is the templated approach. Implement this. You have X amount of months. Let's go. That's just, it's never going to work.
Yeah. Interesting.
Mhm.
What you just mentioned about believing that if you are moving your cows around in a certain way that the rain will come. Have you heard that expression that says rain follows the plow?
No, I haven't. But there you
Now, when settlers in the United States were moving west, they had this belief that rain follows the plow, right? So if they work the land, it'll start to rain and then it'll become, profitable and healthy.
There you go. I mean, exactly. I think a lot of times, for whatever reason, people have these beliefs, as we all have our beliefs, right? So they might say, well, this is what's worked for me in my lifetime, and I'm doing all right in this way. So why am I going to change everything? And so it's just, again, having those conversations and understanding their perspective. And again, not assuming you know better, but figuring out,
Yeah,
then what does that land need?
yeah, totally. Fascinating.
Yeah.
If you were talking to someone at an organization that wanted to get involved in one of these projects and they wanted to ensure that it was socially responsible at the same time as regenerating the landscape, what would your advice be?
Investing the time and resources to listen, learn, and dialogue with land stewards first, and to meaningfully engage the various different land steward groups that will be involved in ecosystem restoration is one of the best investments you can make. And comes as no surprise based on my previous answers, but it's fundamental for establishing trust, securing restoration outcomes, and then avoiding massive headaches and resource and time sucks down the line. So a lot of times I see there's a lot of pressure, understandably so. So people will look to shortcut some of these steps and maybe save some time and money at first, but you're running up an exponentially larger tab down the line. So you're rushing to nowhere and you're eroding the relationships that are the foundation of ecosystem restoration. So I think taking the time to set up that foundation first is one of the best things you can do if you're looking to engage in a socially responsible and frankly, just an effective way in ecosystem regeneration.
You know, yeah, that's a really great way to look at it. That social connection is the foundation of the project in a lot of ways.
It really is. It really is. And I think people forget that there is some sunk costs when you can't, if you don't set up that foundation. Of course, later, once you realize, oh, they have no clue what the project is about, what we're trying to implement, they don't really like us, so they're not going to send us the documentation of their grazing movements or whatever information you may need from them. They say, well, let's go ahead and have those conversations that we skipped at the beginning. But you've already eroded the trust. And I'm not saying it's irreversible, but you're starting at -10 versus at 0. So I think, again, taking the time from the start is one of the best investments you can make.
That's great advice.
Mm-hmm.
If you could take our listeners, to this podcast to one of our project sites, where would you take them and what would you show them and what would you want them to take away from that place?
There are so many different places that I would love to take the listeners and everybody at Cultivo too. I wish we could do a little world tour. I think it would be great.
Me too.
Right? But if I had to pick one place, I would probably say some of the ranches in the north of Uruguay. I would want them to, as I did, drive past a lot of the rural schools and see how they're closing down. I'd want them to see the big, beautiful, empty farmhouses and speak with the ranchers and the ranch hands and listen to them tell stories about the vibrant communities that used to be there and how now a lot of them have to spend most of their time away from their partners, away from their kids and their grandkids who had to move to the city for opportunities, and they're alone in these massive houses. And I'd want them to speak with the younger generation that is so passionate about working the land and wants to continue with this life, but they're cynical about the isolation and instability that comes with that kind of a life. I'd want them to see that sustainable grasslands management isn't just about climate resilience and halting degradation and biodiversity loss and increasing productivity. It's about preserving a beautiful way of life and keeping doors and opportunities open for people to keep living and working on their land. I think once you see those human stories, you realize this is about preserving that way of life.
It's a beautiful answer and an inspiring mission. So thank you for everything you do here at Cultivo. I really appreciate it.
Of course, it's an honor. Happy to do it.
On that note, unless you have anything to add, Tamara, it's been really a pleasure talking to you, and you're doing really important work, perhaps work that, as you said, not everyone considers when they first get involved in landscape regeneration. So hats off to you. Thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been really a pleasure.
Thank you so much. The pleasure's mine. I really appreciate it, Sean.